I feel like I'm not wearing enough layers for how cold it is in Washington right now.
Where's your cardigan?
Oh, like the Jimmy Carter cardigan.
A few weeks after his inauguration, he did a fireside chat. He had asked people to bring their thermostats down to 65 degrees.
But did he practice what he preached?
He did. In fact, he ordered all White House thermostats to be lowered to 65 during the day. But at nighttime, he said that they had to be lowered to 55 degrees. In Rosalind Carter's memoir, she actually writes about watching her secretary like shivering and wearing gloves as she's typing on the typewriter.
Look what happened. Is this crazy? We stand on the verge of the 4 greatest years in the history. Make America great again. How can you be against it?
It's the week of former President Jimmy Carter's funeral, a time for the coming together of national leaders, including former presidents and the current one. And yet, what we heard from President-elect Donald Trump in a press conference on Tuesday was angry and filled with grievances and served as a reminder that Trump is on a revenge mission. Welcome to this episode of Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey, and I'm here with Rhonda Colvin, senior political correspondent, and James Hohmann, editorial writer and columnist. And this is this remarkable moment. Rhonda, you've covered a handful of the funerals of dignitaries like former presidents. We saw like these moving images of Jimmy Carter's casket moving through the streets of Washington, being carried by horses and people lining up to witness it. I mean, it really is like a touching moment in history. And yet we are like barreling fully ahead into what is going to be a really intense transition period as Donald Trump takes office. And we're going to talk about his press conference this week because it was really remarkable in what he's saying as he prepares to move into the White House. Another thing we'll be talking about today is Trump's hush money case in New York. Unless the Supreme Court steps in, he will be sentenced on Friday, the first former president to be sentenced in a criminal case of this scale, convicted on 34 felony counts. We'll see what happens. We'll all be watching that. Let's start with the man who's about to become president, Donald Trump. So, Rhonda, he is so angry, even though he won. It's like you'd think if you listened to that Trump press conference that he was sort of bitter and frustrated because he lost the election, but he's coming in as the victor right on the heels of something you witnessed this week, which was Vice President Kamala Harris certifying his election.
Yeah, it's sort of been just two different worlds, really, because at the beginning of this week, of course, there was a joint session in Congress to certify Trump as the winner. The vice president, Kamala Harris, she oversaw it. She does the procedural language of saying that she had this many votes and he had this many votes and he wins. There was a lot of bipartisanship on the Hill. You could see people feeling good about the moment, visibly at least. Shaking hands. Republicans were shaking hands with Democrats. It was a completely different tone from what we saw from the president-elect yesterday with his press conference, where he seemed to be very angry. Even though he is the winner, no one's arguing that. He has been able to get around the court issues and the legal battles that he's had all year. He's had so many things going his way, but yet this was a press conference that was really reminiscent of some of the moments in his first term, where he goes off and rails about grievances and talks about, a winding number of issues, from windmills and blaming the Biden transition team for not working with his team. And he talks about Jack Smith with the January 6th probe. He talks about taking over, land grabs with the Panama Canal and Greenland. And it feels like we're seeing again what we saw in 2016 from this presidency, and not someone who's trying to sort of bring the nation together a week or so before his inauguration.
Yeah, I'm hearing like Ethel Merman singing like everything's coming up roses, because it is all going Trump's way, right? We got through this sort of like hiccup last Friday with the selection of the House Speaker. It all got ironed out, all got worked out. Ended up being just one vote, could have gone a lot longer. We saw the certification on Monday. He is preparing to take office with majorities in both the House and Senate. And yet, James, like if you guys know the musical Gypsy that song comes from, there's kind of like a really like intensity and like a bit of a megalomania of that song. And I'm feeling that with Donald Trump right now.
Donald Trump is a sore winner, and he is always animated by his grievances. He also can't help but exaggerate. So he's out there talking about how this was one of the biggest landslides ever. And he won. He won the popular vote, which he couldn't say 8 years ago or certainly 4 years ago. But it still feels like he has all these scores that he wants to settle, and that is what drives him. And it is a contrast to the teleprompter part of his speech on election night, where he sort of was kind of magnanimous. I'm going to be a president for all Americans. I'm going to be fascinated to see what the inauguration is like, because remember in the first one in 2017, it was all about American carnage, and George W. Bush famously walked away and said that was some weird shit. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but it was. And so I do wonder, is Trump going to be able to like even just check the boxes of nodding to kind of, I'm going to be a president for all Americans. If you didn't vote for me, I'm still going to be there for you. Or is he just going to go right into, I'm going to deliver for MAGA and my people. And that means, boom, boom, boom. And in the past, he's at least nodded rhetorically to some of that, kind of like, oh, it's time to put aside our differences and bury the hatchet. And this time it doesn't feel like he really wants to do that.
Let's listen to what Donald Trump said. He's asked a question by David Sanger of the New York Times. And I mean, this is really essential. Can you rule out, using economic weaponry or force or the military to go after these places that you want or countries that you're ticked off at? And let's hear what Donald Trump has to say about Panama.
Let's start, if we could, with your references to Greenland and the Panama Canal, so forth. Can you assure the world that as you try to get control of these areas, you are not going to use military or economic coercion?
No.
Tell us a little bit about what your plan is. Are you going to negotiate a new treaty? Are you going to ask the Canadians to hold a vote? What is the strategy?
I can't assure you, you're talking about Panama and Greenland. No, I can't assure you on either of those two. But I can say this, we need them for economic security. The Panama Canal was built for our military.
So we'll talk about the history in a moment, but just your initial reaction to that, James.
Well, it is classic Trump. I mean, it's sort of like taking this hypothetical that's posed by a reporter, which is a legitimate question, and then refusing to rule it out, and creating a news cycle where all of a sudden everyone's talking about as the U.S. It obviously has very real consequences. I do think that it's the kind of thing that makes it harder to criticize Russian territorial aggression against Ukraine. It makes it harder to dissuade China from annexing Taiwan when the U.S. is sort of espousing these early 1900s style imperial views of the world. And it dominates the news. The cover of the New York Post today calls it the Don Roe doctrine, like the Monroe Doctrine. And it's a picture of, the United States, but Canada is the 51st state, and Iceland and Panama. And then
Wait, we're going after Iceland too?
And then the other thing is,
Do we see skipping over Greenland and going for Iceland?
Sorry, yes, thank you, Greenland.
Okay.
And then the other,
two different countries, everybody. Two different
countries.
Places. Greenland, Denmark, Iceland.
But then the other thing he said was, we're going to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. My view on all of this is that it's a distraction. That this is just like Trump being very good at like throwing shiny objects. There was this YouTube video that went viral during Trump's first presidency that had nothing to do with Trump, but that to me epitomized the Trump era, which is this woman dumping a bucket of tennis balls in front of her dog. There's like 20 tennis balls bouncing up and down, and the dog is paralyzed because he doesn't know which ball to run after. And that's sort of what Trump's doing. He's throwing chum in the water. He knows the media is going to say that he's not ruling out military force, that the markets aren't going to take it seriously, and that it's not, and I do think it's a distraction from what he does not want to be talking about.
Which is
this report that Special Counsel Jack Smith has written in 2 volumes. The first about the January 6th case that he prosecuted in D.C., and the second about the classified documents case in Florida. And there were legal filings the same day as the news conference. It came a day after Trump's lawyers sent an angry letter trying to stop this report about his mishandling of classified information from coming out. And I really do think this is what Trump is good at, which is sort of like setting off a smoke bomb and being like, look over there, and throwing it off. And
do you think this is what he's actually so angry about, the Jack Smith filing?
I do.
Maybe so.
I think he's angry about a lot of things. I think he's, but I do think he's angry that he feels like he won the election, that should put all of his legal troubles to rest. That was what drove him to campaign as hard as he did at his age. And he feels like these things are supposed to go away, and they're still kind of coming after him. And I think Trump thinks he deserves more of a honeymoon period. And I think honestly, it's probably emboldening for Trump that so many of like the big tech CEOs are coming, to Mar-a-Lago and kissing the ring, and everyone
he's getting so much money for the inauguration.
And everyone
committee.
is giving $1 million to the inauguration committee, and so I think Trump sort of feels like he's like, do this, and.
But wouldn't that make you happy?
Yeah.
like, wouldn't that make you feel good? Like, but
to that point, it just, in the way James is describing it, it just feels that nothing is ever enough. And there was so much said back when we were covering the legal cases and the trials that we thought would come to fruition and never did, that, okay, he escaped accountability. But at the same time, these cases, even all of them are pretty much on ice or will never see the light of day. That's still bothering him. Right. And when will that stop bothering him? When will he put that aside and, do what people elected him to do? But I do think those cases are still running in the background a little bit, and they seem to still be thorns.
Rhonda, Donald Trump brought up Panama and also the history with Jimmy Carter, it seems so discordant because this is a moment where everyone's remembering Jimmy Carter and the presidency as well as his legacy after the presidency. But we heard like this anger from Donald Trump this week about like losing, air quotes, Panama.
Yeah. You know what? On the campaign trail, I did notice that Trump would talk about Carter in negative ways. And it always startled me because I was thinking, okay, this is a president who has certainly, done a lot for the country internationally. Most people are giving him his flowers right now. He's in hospice. But we did see a little bit on the campaign trail of Trump talking about Carter. So this didn't altogether surprise me. The timing's maybe a little insensitive as we are covering the state funeral process of Carter. But Trump went after Carter on the Panama deal where, to give the history, of course, Carter brokered the treaty that gave the Panama Canal to the Panamanians to control. So before it was in U.S. control, Carter gave that to the local government there, the Panamanians. Trump said that he didn't want to bring it up, but that he thought that was a bad deal and that it ruined Jimmy Carter's career or his presidency. It was a little off. And again, this was just one of the points in this press conference where you kind of were scratching your head wondering where exactly.
Like, why bother? Like, where's this coming from?
It's really not relating to any of the issues I remember voters talking to us about what they wanted from.
Did Panama come up with the voters, Rhonda?
I don't recall.
So do we know why Trump has a bee in his bonnet about Panama?
Well, we know what he says. I don't know the real reason, but what he says is China. That China has gotten control, basically, in his view, of the canal, and that they have kind of like gotten their hooks into it, and that Panama is letting Chinese business buy up certain things, and that's a national security threat, and the United States built the canal and it's not fair, and that if Panama doesn't kick China out, then the U.S. is going to retake the canal. I think that there has been talk about like a Trump land deal there, Trump hotel. Like, Panama has its two big industries are trade and tourism. So I do wonder if there's a deeper story that we don't fully understand. But it also, I don't think Trump was just trying to be a jerk for the sake of being a jerk, but this is who he is. This is kind of the, for lack of a better word, authenticity that, he's He's going to criticize John McCain the week he dies. He's going to criticize George H.W. Bush the week he dies. And, it's sort of tacky. But his, I think, core supporters appreciate that he's, in their view, telling it like it is, even though, I grimace at sort of like speaking ill of the dead. But remember, when John Dingell died, he was like, oh, John Dingell is looking up from hell, and saying stuff like that about Debbie Dingell. And that's just, it is what he does.
So to Rhonda's point, just about, and I'm going to stay in Panama and Greenland, so maybe I'm like following, I'm the dog with all the tennis balls, but it's making international news. But to Rhonda's point about what voters elected Trump for, I mean, we heard a very different message in terms of like America's foreign policy from Donald Trump. It was nationalist and it was also isolationist. Mm-hmm. We've gone from that to like imperialist suddenly with one press conference.
Yeah, very true, because if you remember, on the campaign trail, he discussed how, there were no wars when he was president. And of course, he was talking about Ukraine, he was talking about Israel, and saying that all happened on Biden's watch. So with me, all that stuff ends. So it is interesting to hear him say that he wants to seize land, possibly use the military, U.S. military, to seize this land, when that was an issue that he told voters that he would not, be a part of any sort of conflict. He would be the president to reduce any conflict. So again, it goes counter to what he may have promised or said earlier. But one big picture thing from this press conference that I kept thinking of is, okay, so foreseeably, this is his final term as president. So he should not be, at press conferences in a way that he would be campaigning for another term. So I'm wondering if this type of tone that he's bringing, if the anger, the blaming Biden, how long will that exactly last? Because right now, probably from now until the midterm elections with Congress, his tone is going to matter a lot for the future of the Republican Party. So if he doesn't put more of a positive spin on things or do some of the things that he promised his voters that he would do, I wonder if that affects his party, who many of them will be seeking re-election. So I do wonder the sort of angry Trump, will we just see this from here on out, or is there going to be any sort of change? I have no answer.
He still talks about Hillary Clinton years later. He's still like,
that's true.
Very few events.
But it seems like some people
mention.
just tune that stuff out. I mean, that's
Right.
why. Something else he complained about, though, I'm thinking a lot about Jimmy Carter, obviously, because this is the week we're all honoring him and acknowledging his time in office and service to the nation. Trump was upset that the flags were going to be at half staff because of remembrance of Jimmy Carter during Trump's inauguration.
So the U.S. flag code says that when a former president dies, the flags go to half-mast for 30 days. So that means that on January 20th, there is going to kind of be this awkward metaphor of all the flags in the nation's capital halfway down, which is like this kind of mourning, feels like something's dying, which obviously someone has died. And Trump doesn't...
Someone has died, like a former president.
He was 100 years old.
Yes, please continue, James.
Obviously, it's a tragedy, but I think Trump is sort of like, this isn't fair. He feels like he's being gypped, that he's being denied the flags being at full staff, and so he truthed it. He put on Truth Social that this was unfair and that he was going to try to fix it. But this is literally in like U.S. law.
Yeah.
But there was a moment too when he was president where when John McCain died, Trump didn't want to lower the flags to half staff because McCain is just a senator, not a former president. He'd been a nominee. And John Kelly, then the White House chief of staff, went to him and said, like, if you don't sign this document saying that the flags have to be lowered, then like everyone is going to like spit on your grave when you die, and basically convince Trump to do it by saying, you've got to do this so that when you die, people are respectful.
Yeah, I've also been thinking about that in terms of how we know he is about optics, being a producer, I remember, when we covered the January 6th committee's hearings and how we heard from Cassidy Hutchinson, who said that he wanted to bring down the magnometers because they didn't look great. So he is very aware of what, the appearance of things. But at the same time, there is an argument for anybody, the coming administration, to take a pause, look at a former administration, because right now, a lot of Washington, especially on the Hill, you're seeing this pause of, okay, let's take a break from the politics. Let's examine a person's legacy that, did a lot for the country, did a lot
And
internationally.
also just look at American history.
And, right.
Like I'm so
And people have
nerding
been
out
feeling
about,
good about
like, the
that.
history of the 70s.
Right?
Like, yeah, learning so
That
much.
it's so true. And there were so many people who were not around or don't remember the Carter administration. So they were learning a lot. So it's it really, even though it is a sad period, it's still a time where Americans can feel pretty good about the history and remembering
Isn't that the nature of
presidency.
this moment, right? That's the very, and this is something that Jimmy Carter wrestled with, and maybe not always recognizing the importance of some of these traditions, like feeling that pomp and circumstance. There is a role and an importance to that because it does create a moment of reflection and authority and all those things.
It is like this national, our what do we share, what do we value?
What
I'm
do
so
we
glad
share
you
value?
mentioned that
That's a good way to
because,
put it, yeah.
like, watching the event in the Capitol yesterday, Kamala Harris spoke, but so did Mike Johnson, the Republican speaker, and John Thune, now the Republican majority leader, and both gave very gracious, uniformly positive speeches. It's someone has died. That's what you're kind of expected to do. And it is striking because all of them were young. Kamala Harris is the oldest of those three, and she was in middle school when Carter was president. And, Mike Johnson was a kid. And so he was reflecting on, kind of watching Carter. Mike Johnson said Jimmy Carter's the first president he remembers. And
the first president you remember is an indelible image in your head.
Yeah,
as
exactly.
An American, yeah.
So but anyway, it was like, I'm really glad you mentioned that because it is that contrast to sort of like, this is what whatever normal means anymore, politics. You have these Republicans who are being gracious and then you have Trump, who is going to the funeral.
Yep.
And, he didn't go to John McCain's funeral.
So I want to fact check one thing that you mentioned, James, and sort of as we kind of rattle off the things that Trump brought up at his press conference, complaining about the Biden team not helping them enough. That's not what we're hearing from the behind the scenes people.
Yeah, so Susie Wiles, the incoming White House chief of staff, she gave an interview to Axios and Mark Caputo, who just started there. It was his first story for them. And she actually effusively praised the Biden team for doing a good job of giving them everything they need. I've talked to other people who are in line for big jobs in the government who say that their counterparts are being really helpful for the most part. And so Susie Wiles said that Jeff Zients, the current Biden chief of staff, held a dinner at his house with all the former White House chiefs of staff, and that it was kind of this like clubby dinner, welcome to the it's a fraternity. She's the first woman White House chief of staff, which is amazing and great. Anyway, like it's funny reading her interview because they published the transcript and then comparing that to Trump being like, Biden is just trying to do everything to undercut me. And I do sort of wonder what that foretells about what things are going to be like come February.
I do want to play a little bit more from Donald Trump's press conference. I don't want to get distracted by the bouncing balls or the shiny objects, but this is where he's talking about, to James's point, the legal problems and Jack Smith. And Jack Smith has a lot of information that he is on the verge of releasing, or maybe not. Let's listen.
To read Jack Smith. So he dropped the lawsuits. He was told to by the DOJ because they had no lawsuit. They lost in court. In front of a very strong and a very brilliant judge. They lost in court, and that pertained to other cases in other courts. So he wanted to do a report just before I take office, probably. So he'll do like a 500-page report, and it'll be a fake report, just like the investigation was a fake investigation. And I said, well, wait a minute. This guy was thrown off in disgrace. In disgrace. He's going back to The Hague or wherever they're going to send him. In disgrace. Because he failed so badly, because it was a fake case against a political opponent. They thought they were going to use this to beat me. So what you're saying is I'm just hearing that they're not allowed to issue the report. So if they're not allowed to issue the report, that's the way it should be.
Donald Trump speaking on Tuesday. Rhonda?
Again, it just shows you the anger and the airing of grievances. And I expect, just based on how, the things we've seen from the president-elect before, that this will just continue. We do know that before we came on and taped this episode, that it is expected that Jack Smith will release the January 6th that case's report. The classified documents case, of course, was blocked by Eileen Cannon, the judge in Florida, who was overseeing that case. But we do know that the details of that January 6th probe, the federal probe, will be released by Smith.
Unless
someone intervenes, the Supreme Court could intervene. I mean, what I will say, talking to some lawyers, is it really is shocking what Judge Cannon, Eileen Cannon in Florida, has done, because she said Jack Smith's appointment as special counsel was unconstitutional, which is a big legal stretch. And that is being appealed to the 11th Circuit, which is the appellate court based in Atlanta. And typically, when a case has been dismissed and is being appealed this way, the motion would go to the 11th Circuit. And in fact, the other defendants, Walt Nada, the valet, they actually made a motion to the 11th Circuit asking for them to stop the report from coming out. And so it is highly irregular for this district judge to come in and basically do Trump a solid, as she has repeatedly done. And it does sort of run down the clock. And they know that, it's awkward on so many levels, but Todd Blanche is Trump's lawyer in this matter. He wrote this letter. He's also Trump's nominee to be deputy attorney general. So he's going to be the number 2 guy at the Justice Department in a month. And you have him writing a letter saying that it'd be outrageous if the Justice Department did this. And we're in uncharted waters.
So just because we're talking about it, we'll talk more about legal issues in a moment. But so where does it go from here, though? Since Cannon has done what she has done, where does it go from here?
So the 11th Circuit has asked all the parties to submit briefs on what they think in their argument, and then they have to make a decision. And it seems likely that that's just not going to get resolved and appealed and fought out until after January 20th, by which case Trump will be in control of the Justice Department and can just dismiss the case and drop the motion, and then, frankly, conceal this report about his mishandling of classified information.
Can the Supreme Court, though, be called into this?
Totally.
Can it just be bounced up quickly to?
Yes. And there's like a shadow docket. There are ways that this doesn't, so the 11th Circuit could decide, don't release the report or release the report. And then either side could go immediately to the Supreme Court and they could make a quick decision. The courts are capable of moving quickly on things like this if they want to, but there's just a lot of people who can sort of throw some sand in the gears. I would be surprised if we saw the classified document report ever at this point. But I do think the January 6th report is going to come out because that was Judge Chutkan in DC. She's not going to stop that. And, Eileen Cannon can't stop that part of the special counsel report from coming out.
We're going to talk more about some of the legal issues that are still dogging Trump in a moment. But first, as we talk about angry old men, is it too terrible to say? As we talk about the bitterness that Trump is showing, he's not alone. President Joe Biden gave an interview with Susan Page of USA Today where she asked, and this is going to get asked, but he says he could have won the election, possibly could have won the election. Is he bitter, James? What's going on here? And what other answer could he have given that would have been less of a diss of Kamala Harris and her inability to win the election?
So, he could have dodged it. He's been a politician for more than 50 years. He knows how to not answer a question if he doesn't want to. But what's wild is that the White House vigorously and publicly, as recently as last week, was denying that Joe Biden felt this way. They were saying that was a lie. The reporting that Biden was thinks he would have won when Harris lost, and then Biden just goes out there and says it. So there is some kind of credibility gap there. But I know from reporting, the Post Tyler Pager has reported this. Others, including the Wall Street Journal, have reported that Biden really does think he would have won, and he is bitter. He feels like he was shoved aside, and he doesn't feel like he's getting the respect he deserves, and he is kind of on this YOLO, way out. He's going to Rome on Thursday night, going to meet with the Pope. He's actually in California on Wednesday, seeing a new grandchild. And there's a fire raging just miles away from Malibu. So it's a weird kind of end. I'm not sure what he could have said differently.
He's trying to cement his legacy, right? Like, this is an interview with someone who, Susan Page, has this long career, and this is a moment that she's got such a historical background. This is the moment. This is like the interview that you want people to look at 20 years from now, or at least 6 months from now. And instead of like cementing a legacy, it seems like it's just, dwelling on the things that didn't work out.
Yeah, and kind of giving people more to talk about and speculation.
Right,
of this,
which also has got to be driving Democrats crazy.
Instead of putting it to bed. I suspect we will find out even more, maybe in the short term or years to come from some book somebody's going to write. But it does seem that there was a lot of palace intrigue when this decision was made by Democrats to start coming out and saying that they wanted another candidate. And it also happened so fast. If you remember, it was like just a matter of weeks, if I recall, that in the summer where it was a whirlwind. So I think more may be said about this. I also think from the human perspective, if you look at it, it probably isn't hard to be bitter in a situation like this, because Joe Biden spent all of his life as a politician, mostly as a senator, vice president, then president, and to have an end like this to that career, not only the presidency, but that whole entire career, I would assume many people might be bitter. But often politicians are supposed to rise above that, and especially a president, and at least give some semblance of unity.
Or what you want people talking about, right? Or it's like what you tell your therapist or your spouse or your dog versus what you tell the reporter who's there to break some news, but also is there to try, like, capturing this really significant moment in his presidency, right? The sunset of his presidency and his political career, and this is what he's choosing to go out on.
I just read over the holiday break The Price of Power, which is this new book by Michael Tackett from the Associated Press about Mitch McConnell. And there's an interesting section toward the end of the book, most of it's about his whole career, where Lamar Alexander, the former Republican senator from Tennessee, is talking to McConnell, his best friend. They've known each other since they were interns on the Hill in the 60s. Wow. And Lamar tells McConnell, people always will remember the last thing you do. And it was in the context of like thinking through the last 2 years of McConnell's term. He's no longer a majority leader. And so there's a funny quote where McConnell is quoted in the book saying, I'm going to make John McCain look like a dove, because he's going to be really hawkish and he wants to sort of be like a national security guy, strong on Ukraine, that kind of thing, the last 2 years of his term and the first 2 years of Trump's term. But it is kind of the last thing Joe Biden did in 50 plus years is sort of run again when he really wasn't up for it and wasn't popular. And that is how he's going to be remembered. He's giving 2 speeches next week, we should say. He's going to give 2 big sort of like legacy set piece primetime speeches where he tries to kind of frame how he wants to be remembered. But honestly, like, the country has sort of moved on. It's kind of it's easy to forget he's still the sitting president. When Trump's out there sucking up all the oxygen.
Well, stay with us. In just a moment, we'll come back to talk more about Donald Trump and whether or not he will be sentenced on Friday. This is Sidebar from the Washington Post. Donald Trump is scheduled, as of now, to be sentenced on Friday, but we don't actually know if it's going to happen. Rhonda, at this point, Judge Juan Merchan is moving forward and planning on doing this on Friday.
He is planning to move forward. What we know is that this seems to be more of a symbolic closure to a case. We have to remember that a jury of Trump's peers sat. They did the whole process. To let this evaporate, I think, in the judge's eyes, would be sort of an abuse of the justice system. So they are going to they plan to have a sentencing on the 10th of January, so 10 days before Trump is sworn in. It's so interesting because we know that this is the date that they're going to possibly do this, but the Trump team did try to get out of it by sending it to an appellate court in New York. The New York court said, no, we're denying this filing.
Like, we're not going to intervene.
Right.
Yeah.
And now, as of the last few hours, we are finding out that the Trump team wants the Supreme Court to intervene and block this sentencing. So we will see how this all evolves and if there is an actual sentencing. But it also, once again, it reminds us how novel all of this is, how unprecedented it has been, that there really isn't a playbook. We know, of course, the Trump team has been saying he is president-elect. And before that, they were saying he is campaigning for president. He cannot be held to the same standards as everyone else. Once the Supreme Court ruled in the immunity case, they felt that they had even more to fight with, ammunition to fight with. But this appears to be moving forward. We're just going to have to see where it goes.
I want to talk about immunity in a moment, but I want to dwell on something really important that Rhonda said, that the judge has said, look, the jury found Trump guilty on 34 counts, and he has previewed that Trump's not going to go to jail.
Right.
So he has given us a sense that this sentencing will be really more symbolic, but still important to the judge in terms of the legal process concluding, James.
So some finality. And it is significant that the judge basically said last week when he announced that he wanted to do this, he's not even going to be on probation, where he's going to need a probation officer. There could be a big fine, but there's no jail time.
Why still do it?
And because it does bring the process to finality. It means that Trump will remain a convicted felon, rather than sort of throwing out the conviction. I think in Trump's view, that's the reason he cares, is that this is still he's going to be a convicted felon forever, unless this gets thrown out on appeal or whatever. And so I think the judge just didn't want to wait 4 years of Trump could get sentenced after he leaves office, and this hanging out in the ether. I think the judge thinks, let's bring some finality to it, and he thinks it's actually good for justice, but also for Trump to be over with it. And Trump doesn't want it to be over. His strategy of buying for time has frankly paid off handsomely. Delay worked in all of these cases. And the irony, too, is that if this is the one where there is a sentence imposed, this was the weakest of the four. The classified documents was the strongest. January 6th in D.C. was the second strongest. Georgia was probably the third strongest. New York was the weakest of the four. And it's the one that actually, if anything, I think it actually backfired on Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA. I think it really did create a rally around Trump effect in the Republican Party that we've talked about on the show before. And so it is kind of ironic that this is the one that, we're kind of dealing with in the final days before he becomes president again.
Talk to us about the immunity argument. He's not president yet. He's president-elect. He's already been convicted. We're at the sentencing phase.
So the argument that the Trump lawyers are making is, look, he's becoming ready to be president. He's
president-elect, which is its own title in their mind.
He's making preisiential decisions. He
threatening
is
Greenland and Panama,
exactly.
right?
Building an armada,
right?
To send down.
Should we laugh or not laugh? Let's not.
Well, you have to laugh. Yeah, I got it. I mean, but it is. I mean, and I'm mindful of the laughing,
yes.
But it is hilarious. I mean, it's crazy.
You're in Panama. It's not so funny, but
right.
sure.
Their argument is this is a distraction, that he needs to be able to focus. But I think what they would also argue is that because Trump made these hush money payments and lied about it on his ledgers to Stormy Daniels while he was president. They maintain, and I don't think the Supreme Court immunity decision from July supports this, but they maintain that those were official acts, that because he was president, when he paid off Stormy Daniels, he was doing it to protect his presidency, that therefore it should be covered by this immunity decision. And when there was an appellate argument in New York this week, the judge seemed very skeptical, both of the special standing for a president-elect and also for this immunity argument.
Prosecutors say the president-elect does not equal the president. But Rhonda, is this a test of the limits of the Supreme Court's immunity decision from the summer?
I think it is. And if you read that decision, I remember when we covered it, I remember we raced in the studio to tell everyone what we knew about it. If you read it, you do see a lot of areas where the justices wanted a backdoor for themselves. Like, we're going to hand this over to the judges who are overseeing it to figure out if this applies. So I wonder if they also want a backdoor out of this. I don't know. We don't know anything yet. But it may test their ruling in ways that they did not anticipate. And really, how can you anticipate much of this? Again, it's been novel, it's been unprecedented. There is no template that any part of our court system, from the lower court to the Supreme Court, has ever had to deal with. And I think that's why both arguments, from the New York prosecutor's side to the Trump team's side, seem to have worked. And now we're coming to this clash over this decision just 10 days out before he is sworn back in.
Does Donald Trump's effort to get the Supreme Court to block his New York sentencing test the limits of the Supreme Court's immunity decision?
It does. And this is the kind of spot that Chief Justice John Roberts, who voted in the majority on the immunity decision, doesn't want to be part of. They want to stay out of politics. They want to punt. Rhonda's absolutely right. And I think that, if they just buy some time, it becomes a moot point, and they don't really want to get dragged into the politics. And Roberts is concerned about the perceived legitimacy of the Supreme Court. So you can never be surprised anymore to channel Rhonda. But it does feel like, they don't want to touch this.
Well, believe it or not, we only have one more scheduled episode of Sidebar before inauguration. So one more week with Joe Biden as president. I'm looking forward to talking to you guys next week. And who knows what we'll be talking about, but we'll be here. You can find us on YouTube. A reminder, you can watch us by looking for The Washington Post, and then subscribe to The Washington Post on your YouTube app or website. Do people use websites anymore?
I think so.
Okay, great. Go to YouTube, find us there. You can also, of course, listen to us on your favorite podcast app, and we'll be back with you next week as we get even closer to this presidential transition. For Rhonda and James, I'm Libby. See you next week.